At 9:30 a.m. on June 23rd, 2019, Michael Froede drove his Dodge Ram to the third floor of the Carroll Creek parking garage in Frederick, Maryland. Backing into his parking space, he lit up a couple Camel cigarettes, smoked them. Then he locked his truck, turned, and threw himself off the third story of the parking garage. Froede was a part of a group of people that I've referred to as secret soldiers. These are American servicemen and women who serve in a clandestine capacity in various intelligence roles. Some of them travel under alias. They have their names protected from being revealed to the public by a secret database called DASR. They conduct low visibility operations worldwide. Michael had just recently returned from one of those secret missions to Vietnam ahead of President Trump's summit with North Korean leadership. Michael was highly intelligent and cross-trained in both human intelligence as well as cyber operations. He was one of these secret soldiers. I spent a long time working on Michael Froede's story. I met his widow and his two daughters and got to know a lot about Froede and his family. And I wanted to bring his story to a wider audience by sharing it with you guys on Military Matters. I spoke and interviewed for this show Joanne Wolf, who is Michael Froede's mother. And I also interviewed Erick Miyares, who was not in Froede's unit, but served in another Army compartmentalized intelligence unit and is able to speak to the unique mental health issues that affect, again, this group that I refer to as secret soldiers. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne. She's going to tell us a little bit about who Michael was.
I divorced when Michael was 9 years old. So Alex was 7, moved away from their father in Oklahoma and moved back to Pennsylvania where my parents were and raised them alone by myself. He was not interested. He didn't want any contact with them. He said it was easier thinking they were dead than have to worry about them. So out of that time, Michael has only seen him twice, and both times it was not good. So, it was tough. It was the three of us. I made minimum wage, and I quit my job in the summertime so I could stay home with them and find another job in the fall. He started working at 14 years old. Both of them did. They know the value of a dollar, and they know how hard it is to work when you don't want to. They both have a very strong work ethic. But Michael was a very black and white person. It was either yes or no. I live in the gray area, but he does not. He went to Penn State Hazleton campus for 1 year, came home and said that he wasn't going to go back to college and he was going for IT. He wasn't going to go back because nobody followed rules there. And it bothered him that nobody followed the rules. And I said, honey, you need to go in the Army. That's the only place people follow rules. And so he said, okay, but I'll only go back if I can get into special forces. And I said, oh, you make everything so difficult. And but he at least got in.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like, Michael kind of grew up in a situation where the family's trying to survive, and that kind of imbued a very pragmatic viewpoint, right? Like you said,
yes.
Black and white kind of viewpoint. This is what I got to do. It is this way or it's not. And that's how it is. Yes.
That's how our life was. I came home with so much money, and if they wanted something, I'd lay it all out in front of them and say, okay, this is all we have. This is what we need to do with it. Where do you see the extra money? I mean, that's how they grew up, the two of them. And it was just three of us. That's why, another reason why it's been so hard on Alex and I. Mm-hmm. It's only been the three of us.
College life just came across as unstructured to Michael. So he went and joined the Army, which was a natural fit. He had already attended basic training to be in the National Guard. So it was a natural transition. Michael then ended up in the infantry and deployed to Iraq in 2007. So in December of 2007, Froede was in a Humvee during a mounted patrol in Iraq when they hit an IED. It rattled Froede pretty badly. Physically, he looked like he was unhurt, but he had the symptoms of a traumatic brain injury. He did end up suffering some physical injuries down the line that he had to have taken care of. But the interesting thing was that his wife at the time, Kate Kemplin, was a nurse at Fort Bragg, and she was getting her master's degree studying military TBIs. And she called up Michael's unit surgeon and asked to have him put into a MRI to be scanned and checked for, brain injuries. They said that they just could not put every single soldier who needed it through an MRI machine because it would set the machine on fire. I mean, that's how many people were being exposed to these roadside IED blasts. I went through Froede's medical records. I had access to all of his military records as I was working on this story. And we'll come back to this later, but I discovered that Michael went to a Army psychologist where he was stationed in Germany after this deployment. And he self-reported feelings of paranoia, that he felt like people were following him around the post exchange. And he went through a certain amount of treatment for both some psychiatric treatment and some physical rehabilitation after that blast. But I thought it was very interesting considering what he went through later in life, that report of paranoia. So we'll get back to that in a minute. But right now we're going to head back over to Joanne.
I never watched television anyway, so he told me not to. And I never read the newspaper. I never asked questions about it. That's how I handled it. I just could not, I didn't listen to the news. I listened to him. If I asked him a question, he would tell me, and I believed him. And that's how we managed.
As time went on, I mean, he got hit with that IED in Iraq, and that looking through his medical records, I mean, he had some like not just cognitive problems, but he had like some physical problems. Like there's some stuff messed up with his leg, with his eye. Yeah.
His legs bothered him the most, and he had very skinny legs to begin with, but his legs bothered him the most. His knees bothered him. You could hear him actually, his bones creak when he walked. He was in a lot of physical pain, but he still ran every day before he even died. He ran 10 miles. That's the way he worked off his anxiety.
After Michael's time in the infantry, he went into human intelligence. So human intelligence, as it sounds, it involves eliciting information from human sources, amongst other skills. And Michael really, when you look at his military records, he went through all of the courses. One friend of mine described Michael as a human beast based on his military training. He was also cross-trained later in cyber warfare. And Michael then at a certain point in his career sort of made the jump from the, I guess you could say, to the clandestine side of Army human intelligence. He joined a program that's called Great Skills. It's sort of a non-conventional career path for HUMINT professionals. This is when his name would have been protected from public release by the DASSER database. And he found himself in a unit called ComTech, Communications Technology Activity. What exactly that unit does, the Army doesn't say. Their cover story is that they sort of study enemy communications. The reality is that they have a mandate for human intelligence and cyber intelligence, and what's called sometimes signature reduction, a number of different things that they conduct there. So Michael joined that unit, and as he did, his mental state continued to deteriorate. Mm-hmm. And as time went on, I mean, what was going on when he decided to make that transition from the infantry to human intelligence?
I have no idea because he didn't tell us. I had no idea. He never told us anything. He said, I'm just an accountant, basically. I'm just a desk guy. He never told us anything. I didn't know until he died what he did for a living.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I did not know.
And in the meantime, when did Alex get out of the military?
Alex got out of the military. Oh, I wrote it down here somewhere. He was in 6 years. So if he went in...
So he probably came out in like 2012 or 2013?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Somewhere around there?
Yeah.
And Michael continued with his career?
Yes. Yes.
So where do you think we should pick it up then? I mean, you said he never really told you what was going on. Did you have any like awareness of, his declining mental state in those last couple of years?
I never picked, I could read him like a book. I remember when he went to school in California and said, I passed the course for lying. I said, I'm not surprised. I mean, you were practicing on me for years. So, that doesn't surprise me. I would say the last year, he paced a lot. He couldn't sit still. His eyes would look all over the room all the time. He never seemed to relax. He couldn't relax. He didn't know how to relax. And, he was always up and down all the time. And, that's how I noticed it. Because he was always antsy. He was always, whenever we were with him, we were always doing something. We were hiking. He had us shopping. But there was always something that he wanted to do. But this was nervousness last year. It was nervousness.
And in the meantime, his brother is dealing with PTSD at home, right?
Yeah. Yes, and he dealt with it through alcohol, where Michael never did. Mm-hmm. Michael didn't drink. He might have had like an inch at night before he went to bed or something, but that was pretty much it, even if he did that.
I asked Joanne to describe the last time that she saw her son, Michael.
The last time I saw him, he looked different to me. He looked older. He looked stressed. If he talked to me, they were short answers. He didn't go on and on. I knew something was wrong. And he called me several times on the phone, and he would cry and say, they want me to go for counseling, and I hate it. I just can't do it. And I said, Michael, you have to do it. And he goes, I can't, because it's not counseling that they're doing. And so he had a real difficult time with that. That's the moment that I knew he was in a downfall. And I wish at that point, and that was right after Christmas, I wish at that point someone would have called his family, because he would not have done this in front of Alex and I. He wouldn't have. And wouldn't have. I know he wouldn't have. And I wish that they had notified the family. Why don't they notify family members? Not everybody's married, but they do have moms somewhere that care. They do have brothers that care, sisters that care. Why can't they reach out to the extended family and say, listen, he's struggling. Why don't you come and see him? See if you can talk to him. And no one called us. And Michael wouldn't call us. Well, he did call us. He spoke to his brother every day. But he wouldn't talk to me because he knew I would pick up on it.
Yeah.
So he avoided me because I could hear it in his voice. So he avoided me for that reason.
At this point, I just want to take a moment to talk about some additional details of the multiple problems that were compounding upon each other and weighing on Michael Froede's shoulders. In that last year or 2 years, a series of things happened. Michael's father passed away. His father was a alcoholic that he never got along with, and he unfortunately felt that he didn't have any closure after his father passed away. Then there was unfortunately the event of one of Michael's teammates at Comtech passing away. Her name was Shannon Kent, who was killed by a suicide bomber in Syria. Michael started having more and more problems, feelings of paranoia. A coworker came over to his house and found that he had unscrewed all the light bulbs because he thought that his house was bugged. And unscrewing light bulbs would defeat those surveillance devices, I guess, in his mind. He started feeling that he was under surveillance, that there were surveillance teams following him around Washington, D.C. He would take pictures of cars outside of his house, making sure to take pictures of the license plates. He would sort of double back around on who he thought was following him and take pictures of their cars. Which is interesting because this is not how we train people to conduct counter surveillance or how to avoid surveillance. And I think that alludes to the fact that Michael was becoming increasingly irrational and unhinged. In the final weeks of his life, he wrote a letter to his unit sergeant major requesting to be taken off the job. I read that letter, and it's frankly off the wall. I mean, there's clear signs. I'm not a doctor, but I think there's clear signs in that letter that Michael was having a mental health crisis at this point. I've been told that his coworkers at Comtech were saying that Michael was unable to recognize his own coworkers in the office, that he would ask, "Hey, who is that person? Who is that guy? What's he doing here?" And they'd be like, "Michael, like, you sit next to him in the office. You see him every day. Like, what are you talking about?" I was even told that the day he died, he couldn't recognize his own vehicle, that his friends had to walk him to his vehicle because he couldn't find it on his own. So things continued to get worse and worse and worse.
We got the call from his girlfriend in the morning on a Saturday morning. Not from the police, not from the military, from the girlfriend who was desperately trying to find a number to call us. Mm-hmm. I thought that was inappropriate. I thought that the police should have called us. Maybe the Army. I didn't know this girl. For her to call me and say, my son is in critical condition, he's on life support, you have to hurry up and get here. That was horrible. It put both Alex and I in shock, and we had to make a 10-hour drive.
And what was the situation when you arrived at the hospital?
There was somebody at the door for us. Someone from the unit was waiting for us. We got there. His whole team seemed to be there in the hallways talking. Alex went right into his room. It took me a minute. I had to stand back and look at him through the glass before I was able to actually walk in and be with him. Everybody stepped back. They allowed Alex and I our personal time. People did come in and out. I can tell you that nobody of importance ever came to see me. They might have talked to Alex more than they talked to me, but it was no one really talked to me. Like I said, I never spoke to anybody higher than an E8, and Michael was an E7. The hospital did their job, but I'll tell you what, I looked at that boy, and you would not know that he fell from 4 stories because there wasn't a scratch on him. Not a scratch. Just the tips of his earlobes were turning blue from lack of blood supply to the brain. But I wanted to make sure it was him, so I looked for his tattoo. I looked for his some scars on his knees that he had. I wanted to make sure it was him because there wasn't a scratch on him.
And what was the soldiers or the NCOs that you did talk to? I mean, what did they tell you? What were you getting from the military at this time?
At this time, when we went back to the house, his team would show up one at a time every evening. No one ever said, why do you think he did it? No one ever said, why? They were all afraid because they had then to go into counseling, and they didn't want to do counseling because look what happened to Michael. So every night there was one or two soldiers on our deck with Alex crying, literally crying, that they did not want to go into counseling because look what happened to Mike. I found it strange that no one ever asked, why did he do it? It was almost like they knew he did. They knew, so they didn't have to ask. That struck me as unusual. And then two men came in, immediately wanted his ID card and his credit card, and they left. No, hello, I'm so-and-so, no, nothing. In the house, grabbed their stuff and left. The person I talked to the most was the gentleman from the funeral home. I spoke more to him than anybody else. And that's a shame.
2 weeks later at Fort Meade, a memorial service was held by Michael's unit.
They did a ceremony for him. They took us to a parking lot and made us take away all of our phones. No recording, no pictures, nothing like that. His ex-wife his ex-wife created quite a stink because she had photographers there. She wanted pictures of them. She wanted, of the ceremony and of the girls and stuff like that. But it was very hush-hush, very quiet, subdued. Nobody stood around and talked about him that I could see from his unit. The one thing I do question is when we entered the building, we were put in a room where all of his medals were and his shadow box and his I Love Me book. And I went to the ladies' room, and as I was going into the ladies' room, two soldiers were standing there, and one of them said to the other, "Isn't it funny how things take care of themselves?" And I turned and looked at them to see, who were they talking to or what? And I then went into the ladies' room. When I came out, they were gone. I do not know who they were, but it seemed inappropriate for where they were that they would say, "Isn't it funny how some things take care of themselves?"
Ideal for fishing, especially if one needs to quickly cut a line, the Romeo folding knife comes with a light carbon fiber handle with an amazing grip and a D2 steel blade. Fair warning, the blade is extremely sharp and cuts through the toughest materials. What makes it simple is the flipper tab. The knife pops open for quick use all in one single motion. Go to tektogear.com today. Tecto Gear is giving 15% off the entire purchase.
Right now, I would like to transition over to Erick Miyares. Erick is a retired Army Sergeant Major. He served in a clandestine intelligence unit in the United States Army. He did not know Michael Froede, did not serve in his unit, but it is kind of a small world, I guess you could say. And Erick is uniquely qualified, I feel, to speak to some of the mental health issues and how they affect people in this clandestine world. So at this point, I want to introduce you to Erick, and then we're going to talk about some of the mental health issues that affect Army intelligence folks.
So briefly, I came from Miami, went into the Marine Corps, spent 6 years there, about 6 years, then came into the Army. Interestingly, I actually chose to leave the infantry and join the Army intelligence as it was sort of a pathway that I had, a trajectory to go hopefully into the future into a national agency or even federal service. So I looked into wanting to go into military intelligence. And so you're right. I didn't know Froede, but I was in the larger military intelligence field, and in particular, when I started, was in 7 Special Forces Group as a SOD Special Operations Team Alpha, SIGINT, but still obviously in Boston, everything that's in intelligence. So did that for 2 years and had my share of a few dings. And tactically, but also that was the first exposure at that time into the larger sort of national security agency and the IC apparatus at sort of a novice level. And then in around 1999, I went through a selection process, and in 2000, went into the former unit that I went into, which conducted more of intelligence work at a tactical, operational, and strategic level. And there is where I gained the larger aspect of my experience working in intelligence.
Erick, I kind of wanted to use your knowledge base to get some insight into Michael Froede and people like him, because I think that the American public has a general understanding at this point that we send soldiers to war, they are in combat, and many of them have post-traumatic stress from that experience. But I think there's a lot less understanding about the unique ways that the intelligence field and that profession impacts our soldiers. Some people, as I'm sure you run into, Erick, a lot of Americans don't even understand we have Army spies. They probably don't even know that exists, right?
Yeah, the PTS for MI, and again, I'm speaking in my experience and the folks that I worked with, and actually looking back in time, if you would, from about 2000, when I went in with a particular peer group of other intelligence professionals, and in this matter would be special operations intelligence professionals, and then towards the end of my career, which is I've been out for about 2 years, and looking back at those 20 years and guys and girls that I still maintain contact with, who have shown tear and wear of PTS and traumatic brain injuries and moral injuries and things that have affected their careers and their marriages. So that's kind of what I'm going to use for my base. And additionally, also, I'll share where I fell on my face several times and didn't realize that was what was going on with regard to PTS and the mix of traumatic brain injury, which can't be ignored, which will impact your cognitive bandwidth, which is what makes, in my opinion, these professionals sort of have issue. And so if I can, I'll start with, you're right, the general public probably thinks that, military intelligence, I don't know, there used to be a saying it was redundant, right? Like, why would the military
an oxymoron.
Yeah, it's an oxymoron. There you go, right? And I was like, and I stepped into that one time and I was like, that's kind of interesting. However, it is a demanding field. Post or pre-September 11, from what I saw, and again, I was fortunate and unfortunate to an extent, coming from the Marine Corps into the Army, I went straight into the Special Forces community, right? And so life there was a little bit different, and we quickly had a mission to go to. However, into the future, I would see where military intelligence professionals in the Army and across would come from field stations, right? And I think that's what most people may know military intelligence professionals that, hey, they work in Hawaii or these buildings with no windows, and it's just got this, they're just told what to do in this little specialty, and that's about it. And however, that's not the case, at least in the Army, and to some extent from what I've experienced from the Marines post me leaving, they're entrenched in a lot of work and in a lot of capabilities at the national level. So they're, many of them will have a career where they have to learn to do military intelligence work with capabilities at a tactical level next to a line unit or in a tank or, in some other capacity, all the way to strategic, as we mentioned, sort of embedded into an intelligence agency as a green suiter, as a soldier, but working with civilians that are in fact, or their government, civilians. However, they have a different system to take care of them. And so for after September 11, and we'll use that as a it just exploded, right? So at least definitely in the special forces community, these guys went from a training environment, if you would, to doing some foreign internal defense type missions, to going forward with these capabilities in the same trenches, for lack of better words, than their Green Beret counterparts or their infantrymen, and quickly jumping into that. And I would want to say without that preparation, right? Because for many military intelligence professionals, it's literally that word at the end is professional. You've got to stay on top of technologies in targets, and many of them have languages, and languages are not easy. I mean, to summarize it really quick, if you fail a language as a military intelligence professional, you can lose that job, right? So you'll go back into the needs of the Army. And so there's a lot of stress from the beginning in a framework, if you would, the Army framework, which is still having soldiers, complete in a given month 5 classes because they have to check the block. Well, that military intelligence professional has to do those same activities, some of the tactical soldiering, but then also their professional development if they want to continue to move forward.
That's like really important background. And I just wanted to ask you about the particular stresses that exist for a military intelligence professional when you're operating in a clandestine environment, maybe how that differs than when a soldier is in combat. Now we're talking about a soldier who is, quote unquote, undercover. What is that like? And how does that impact, your personal life when you return home, your family life? What was your experience?
And that's a good point. So, if you sped forward and now these professionals decide that they want to take it to the next level, right? And a lot of it is guys that then choose to stay in the military for one reason or the other, rather than going into their civilian counterpart, right? Into going to the NSA, CIA, whatever you can name the agency, they decide to do it in the military. Now, within the military, from my limited scope, there are only a handful of programs that will then take this individual into sort of, what you mentioned, the clandestine world, right? Into the more spooky side, if you would, of intel work, right? So that's actually, going into a foreign country and for all intents and purposes, actually having to do employ tradecraft, right? Clandestine tradecraft. And then you're doing collection, human collection, signals intelligence, or some other form. And so, as us in the military, there aren't manuals for this, right? And normally in the military, if there's something that we do, then there's a manual for it. There isn't a lot of manuals of how military intelligence do clandestine operations, because it's in very, very small sectors of the military, if you would. And so you're throwing essentially a person, again, and this is just kind of a very broad brush, into this role where there may not be the support mechanisms, right? That means, hey, how do we really then tell your family that you went from what you did potentially years before, that you can talk about it, to a more restricted, you can't talk about it because of mechanisms maybe of how you employ or deploy that can't be talked about, right? For example, you can't call home, or there's certain things that need to stay at work. And so that starts to take a toll on the person who is now going beyond, if you would, in these roles, that their counterparts at these other agencies have mechanisms to facilitate that. I mean, we're still in the military, right? And then early on in September 11, again, we went from, guys at field station to now having to throw, in general, these folks out and about in a variety of ways, and in particular support special operations or support the greater IC forward. And so the stresses on the family, I think, for me now, in retrospect, is one of the most important things that we have failed to do, is sort of identify the family. Why? Because the individual can suffer with it. He can go back to this, wherever the office that he's at, and potentially talk to his leadership, talk to his peers and go, hey man, this is bugging me. I don't understand this. I went on a trip, or the team sergeant may say, hey, you need some additional clandestine training, or we're going to teach you some techniques to learn, how to deal with potentially some of these stresses. But what I've experienced is bringing in that family into that fold is not there. And as we know, our families are our foundation. So we essentially start to lie to our family members about what's really affecting us. I don't even want to say it's about what we can't talk about. It's what's affecting us. And in time, that starts to chip away at you. And from what I read from Froede, then, in his career, from what I gleaned, is he continued to push forward to do more and more better things, right? And again, in these folks that do this, they're in demand. It takes a lot of screening, takes selection, it takes training. You got to keep these folks. So there's more mission than military intelligence folks can do. And so that's where you start getting this axis and this breaking point of the family isn't aware. They can't help their husbands or their children. And now the individual, because of one simple thing, right? And this is the genesis, what we hear a lot about, is guys don't want to talk about mental health or PTSD problems because they don't want to lose their clearance. That perception that if I talk about it and I show weakness, or mentally in particular, then I'm going to fail, a polygraph, or I'm going to fail and lose my clearance because I'm some sort of medication. And then now I jeopardize my ability to do that. So hopefully that kind of sets another little framework there for you.
I did want to ask you, and I know this is kind of like sensitive ground to tread on because neither of us knew Michael, neither of us are psychologists that can diagnose him, but there is quite a bit of evidence that he may have had PTSD and TBI, which I don't think would really surprise any of us. And I was wondering if from your own experience, or if you'd seen it in teammates of yours, what do you think Michael was going through in sort of those final months of his life? What do you think he was experiencing, and where do you think things kind of broke down? Okay.
That's a good question, and I appreciate that question because as I try to help, others in the same field, is unfortunately we have to look at incidents like this and sort of understand it so we can quickly get to the next guy or girl that may be in a similar situation. And so I was, I'm going to mention that just from some of the readings and how I try to put myself in his shoes and go, okay, did you feel anything similar to that? And I would say that the number one, and I've actually spoken about it, I think in our show when we talked, was the fear of compromise, right? That fear of compromise can freaking drive you nuts, right? Because again, you're still in the military, right? So you may not have, and I'm going to be simple here, you may not have all the same protective measures that the big boys and the big IC and the big intelligence community may have to protect your cover, your status, your family, your activities. And so at the end, you may start thinking, man, do they know who I am? And is this stuff going to come back to my house? And then if I did something and I sort of may have compromised, but I don't have that counterintelligence mechanisms to know that I got compromised, right? As we see in the stories, like the Russians following someone for years and trying to get in their computers, and now they're being targeted with the old human tradecraft, and that person doesn't realize that maybe they were compromised or they have a weakness, and so that can eat at you when again you can't go back and talk to your family about it. And at some point, you may not even want to talk to your friends or your teammates because, crap, you don't know how that's going to snowball because maybe you didn't perceive it right. Or you couldn't go talk to a psychiatrist or a therapist who's there with an open mind, which I hope they are today, going, hey, let's talk about this because you're still human at the end of it, right? So I would say the fear of compromises is one that can gloom over you. Second, PTS is just the fear of the fear of loss of life. Well, that can emanate from jumping out of an airplane. That can be from you're going through a foreign airport and you think you're going to go to secondary, right? That can be a very traumatic, especially if you're not comfortable living the life, as you mentioned, as a spy, right? Maybe you're more comfortable just being you, but not living that clandestine world. You just want to get in country and go to an embassy or wherever and go work, but going in and out of a country, that can eat at you. So that fear compromise, that PTS builds. Now, we're all soldiers. We all still, are military. So we all have to train. And now you start getting, concussions and these TBIs. Well, I learned from experience that how when I went back in time, and I think when we spoke about it, the number one that I had was in 2006. And I didn't realize how impactful in a negative way that was to my life cognitively. Well, what does that mean? That means I couldn't sleep. And, and this isn't, SEER school, this isn't Ranger school or whatever, where it is okay not to sleep for a certain amount of period. You are now not sleeping because you're challenged by these concussions, and you're getting less and less and less sleep. And as we know, the less and less sleeping time that you get, the less you can really process reality around you. And so you put that together in sort of this military intelligence professional, which is, he isn't an assaulter, right? That they're not in a team generally working with, 12 people or 4 guys. They may be going in and out and swapping and replacing someone forward. So that individual is the one that's taking the toll himself. And there is no reset button, not that I knew of when I was getting out. Again, in 2019, we lost 2 guys. And we had amazing resources and people that we were almost, I wasn't best friends with these guys, but his best friends were always at their houses. So they knew them really well. And this still happened, now to the effect of, am I think I'm being, followed or some of these potential paranoias? Hell, we've all been in the woods when we're all exhausted and we thought we heard something. We thought we saw somebody come in. We thought, and at the end it was our eyes, it was our, our brains. And so hopefully that can paint and, you can pull apart from that. But I think that's what really potentially impacted him was just a potential exhaustion and maybe not the ability to talk in a way that we should have taken someone who probably, I guess I'm sorry, I'll stop here in a minute. His career was pretty long. It appears that he was going and going and going and going and didn't get a reset. I was fortunate to get a reset, and I'll just mention it really quick, at NICL, the National Interpretive Center of Excellence. But that was in 2019 where I took a knee in the darkest corner that I've ever been in my entire career. And I went to that facility, and till right now, 2 years later, I'm still learning. Right now, I'm still learning, Jack, of how to wake up sometimes and process memories of, assignments that I was on and really just getting my bearing for certain things. I can't imagine what Michael was going through.
And then that, what is it, NICL? I mean, that program has really helped a lot of guys.
It has, because you are, it's, whatever, it's like 15 professionals and one leading doctor, but their approach is a holistic approach. So they take the service member and obviously it's focused on the brain, but the brain controls everything, right? All the way to they're studying your gut, because your gut then feeds the brain. And so sleep and the psychological aspects of the traumatic brain injury, which obviously it goes hand in hand with PTS. Right. Most guys are going in and they're having brain issues, but they're also having, mental health things that they need to balance. And if they don't balance that mental health, they're not going to take care of that brain. Because for a lot of them that are there, they're in shock that there's something even wrong with them. Mm-hmm. And now they start finding out hey man, you if we take you out of your comfort environment of your unit and now you're in this hospital for a month, you get kind of squirrely because you've never been under the microscope that long. You've never allowed yourself to even admit to yourself that there's something wrong, from sleep, joint hurt, bad memories. And it's evident if you would, and this actually, I'm glad we went down this route, the masks that are at NICL, that these military people look at, if you want to, for your paper or what you're doing here, is just study and sample, 10 of those masks. When I went into that art room, it was scary, Jack. I mean, it literally looked, and some of these they're horrible. They were just
You're talking, it's an art therapy, right?
It's the art therapy. And at the end, it's combined, like, so it's an 8-hour day, probing, blood work, TBI, whatever. And then there's music and then there's artwork. And so this art therapist, along with the other therapists, they're walking you through your demons, for lack of better words. What's bothering you? What moral injuries do you have? And then each individual starts to create and draw these. And it's not even just paint on a mask. They'll tear them up. They put knives through them. They put them in boxes. They put mirrors. They're almost like 4-dimensional masks. And when you look at it, sometimes they're from the perspective of the inside of the mask. And you're like, oh my God, if we would have done this to someone, I don't know, maybe Mike, 5 years earlier, and if he couldn't express himself by words, but by art's what they realize, that's people can then, if you just evaluate that art, you're like, okay, that guy, these people need, their demons right there in that mask. And I think that's really powerful to sort of see that. But
there's also something to be said, I have come to learn, Erick, for people, that it's as you said, you're still learning. It's a process that you have to stick with it. I recently I wrote about a SEAL Team 6 operator named Bill Mulder, and he went through that program, but he didn't continue, follow up with the treatment afterwards. And unfortunately, his situation got worse and worse, and he ended up taking his own life. With Michael Froede, there's some available mental health resources, but it got to the point where he was so paranoid, he thought that his psychiatrist was a undercover CIA officer interrogating him and trying to find his flaws and things. And by that point, it was just, I don't want to say hopeless, but he was so far gone. It was really it would have been very difficult to get him back on track. It's just, these stories are so sad and they just keep coming at us. I guess the last thing I'd really like to talk to you about is how can we do better for these folks, these guys who are in the Army clandestine community, or the operators, intelligence professionals, whoever they are, and the unique challenges that they have in that career field. How can we as a society, or as a country, or as a Department of Defense, do a better job for these guys and make sure they get the help that they need?
No, that's a great question. I think the first one would just be remove the stigma, right? And I'm not talking about like not in a bad way, but to do the 22 push-ups, that's kind of like a philosophy, if you would, or a journey. It is remove the stigma of mental health. Crap, we worry so much about people's physical health, right? Oh my God, you sprain your ankle from a jump. And we know what that is. We know paratroopers get hurt in their ankles because they roll an ankle. And then the infantry guy, his back hurts because he carries all that weight. We need to really focus. I think it's overarching, remove the stigma on mental health. It is just like physical health. And I would say even like spiritual. Every command has they have the chaplains, and we talk about God and we talk about faith and religion, but somehow this mental health, and again, I'm dated now 2 years out, but just in some of the work that I do with the nonprofit, looking into some of these organizations, that's still sort of a taboo, right? Like, oh, hey man, if the guy thinks he's crazy, then he's got to be crazy. Well, no, we're investing a lot in these people. We've put them through GWAT. God knows what the next cycle of warfare is going to look like. And it can be, and here's how I look at it from a national security perspective, that can be, and to the point of Michael, that can potentially be armed, right? If our adversaries realize that the U.S. military has been going strong on GWAT and we're falling apart because of mental health, point blank, people are killing themselves, right? These SEALs, these SF dudes, these elite warriors, not that they're any different than the military intelligence guy or a support individual, but if they're committing suicide, then the baseline of the military is there's a flaw, right? If you can invest $1 million on an operator and he's committed suicide, that doesn't look like the math is even for guys like Michael, if you would. I think mental health is the first one, and that should open and I think we spoke about this before, and maybe the analogy would be, and I've seen it before with commands, is they'll take the maintenance of an aircraft a boat, a tank, it's really serious. Like if you're the ops officer, you're asking that command, is that tank, helicopter, airplane ready for its deployment a year from now? Well, how come we're not taking a similar approach to the mental health, the simple mental health in a holistic way, right? For our military and in those that we know that their work, evaluated work, is going to have extreme mental rigors. Well, in the case of Michael, it is, because now we've just talked about what the world of a military intelligence professional is, hey, you're doing spooky stuff that in general, everything is classified. The Army programs don't generally bring in family to explain what these military intelligence professionals are going to do. Are they going to work in cover? Are they going to be, they don't talk about that. Versus an infantryman, a family member could easily Google or look up, what does an infantryman do? What does a SEAL do? But there isn't that same understanding of a military intelligence. So the commands have to, I believe, in my opinion, is definitely take mental health seriously before the guy leaves and girl. And when they come back, debrief that person. And, and I'm not talking about counterintelligence. Yeah, that's important. But hey, how are you doing? What did you feel? Did you get into a point where you thought you had PTSD? Did you fear for life? Did you fear for compromise? Is this overwhelming, right? And one thing that I noticed now, and if I would be back in soldiering, and I try to pass this on to some of the guys that are young leaders in the unit, is, hey man, look at your guys' evaluations, his language scores, right? If their language scores are falling down, right, that's because mentally, if they're coming in, they're grumping, and now we're paying, like, it's no longer, hey man, that guy's just a grumpy asshole. Okay, was he a grumpy asshole when he got to the unit? No. He's a grumpy asshole now because we already know that the math equals that you're going to have irritability. You're going to be angry. You're not going to sleep. Hey, he's potentially going to get into divorce. So between the mental health, removing that stigma, and looking at these identifiers, I think you'll make the Army and the military will retain its capability to successfully employ and retain, military intelligence professional. I don't know what kind of feedback you got or came back from Michael's, from his death and his role. Is that something that we're not going to be able to recruit folks, right? If they're plain and simple, civilians are looking at that, or mothers are looking at that going, yeah, Bob, you're not going to join the military to go do military intelligence and learn Arabic because I know what may happen to you, right? I mean, that's a little bit of a far stretch, but it could be that way, right? So I think, again, to circle back, we got to remove that stigma. Mental health has to be just as important as we do physical health. And then internally, the leaders, the command, obviously that's a little bit harder to immediately. But if someone's listening to this and they're an NCO or they're young officer and they're in charge of their people, just talk to these folks, right? And just remove that stigma, help them out. You know them better. If NCOERs are tanking, and the guy was a high performer 2 years prior, and now you're counseling him and he looks like he's having, I think those are, especially if you're in the military intelligence, there's that oxymoron, right? I think we're smart enough if we're smart enough to go spy for this country, and go find bad guys so they can be demised, I think we can probably use some of that critical thinking to help our own people stay healthy. And it's the health of the force, right? Again, because if we start showing vulnerability into the future, can you imagine how that's a vulnerability that an adversary can exploit just simply by, psychological warfare? And then you go kill yourself, guys, go kill yourself, or whatever. Right. So.
I mean, yeah, it's wild. And I think that you're making a great point about how it's a human issue and there has to be kind of a human centric approach. There's really no substitute for, knowing your soldiers and caring about your soldiers. And just to, reiterate, I think what you've said, I'd also remind guys out there that, being a squad leader or a platoon sergeant or something, job like that, you have almost as much effect on the soldiers in your unit as their parents did. Like it can be that big of a life impact on them for the entire rest of their life. So don't ever underestimate the power is maybe just the wrong kind of word, but the impact, the influence that you have on those young soldiers for the entire rest of their lives, and how they see themselves and how they see their country and the military. I mean, it's really incredible and a little scary when you think about it, you know, but I say it as a good thing. I mean, you can really have a positive impact on these young troops. So I hope that the team leaders and squad leaders and platoon sergeants out there never underestimate themselves or think that, you know, they can't make a difference, because they do make a really big difference.
And that's a key point. I mean, we grew up having examples, right? So we grew up, looking up towards our squad leaders and platoons, and we wanted to be like them. We wanted to emulate them. And so they were tough, and they were drinking all night and able to come in the morning and do PT. Then that's what we aspire to be. However, maybe a little bit of a flexibility should be, hey, Sergeant John went and he went to talk to the therapist, or he's doing mindfulness, or he's doing breathing, or he went with his family to a retreat to, resync, and he's being checked. And you can still be strong and tough and an amazing leader and an amazing, for you, sniper and all of these things, but still be human. And I think that's again, removing that stigma, but creating that example that you can incorporate mental health, and then just talking to people. However, Mike started to get to a point really quick on having these paranoia. I really hope that someone didn't hear that and they didn't act on it, right? If a team leader or squad, somebody heard, I mean, that's not like, hey, I have moral injury because my intelligence led to the death of someone. Like if you're like, hey, I think the therapist is Russian, and he communicated that with someone, then there needs to be some reflection on, hey, take that stuff serious, especially when someone that you entrust them to do that level of work, that prior trip, you're making him do, from the story I read, I mean, he's at the national level, protection for, diplomats or whatever he was working on, or sensitive collection and special operations. Wow, that person was entrusted to do that. But now you're hearing this. Well, hey, maybe you may want to look at that. And if it's put that person to take a timeout for the betterment of them, their family, and at the end, the reputation of the command, then please do so.
While reporting on Michael Froede's death, I contacted Special Operations Command and Intelligence Command, and SOCOM told me that they continue to investigate proven methods and develop further methods to treat post-traumatic stress, but really nothing beyond that. Intelligence Command, or INSCOM, said they would work with me for months. They had questions for their unit surgeon about mental health issues. They told me they would get answered, and then after months and months, they abruptly said that no, they could not answer my questions because they had launched a new investigation into Michael Froede's death. So that was disappointing that I wasn't able to have their comment on the record about this story. I had some sources tell me that the investigation into Michael Froede that Intelligence Command is doing is really looking into two subjects. One of them looking into trying to find out if the Russians had been blackmailing Michael Froede, which is complete nonsense based on my own investigation. That just there's nothing to substantiate that at all. The second subject that they are investigating, I'm told, is me. They want to know who talked. They want to know who talked to me for this story. So needless to say, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in Intelligence Command. This command has recently had their command sergeant major commit suicide. Their former unit commander, the former INSCOM commander, committed suicide just recently. There have been a string of suicides and murders in Intelligence Command, and other issues as well. So I don't know who can read the article I wrote about Michael Froede or listen to this podcast about him and think that their big takeaway is, oh, was he being blackmailed by the Russians? And oh, by the way, who talked to Jack about this? That doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in this command and their seriousness about dealing with mental health issues for their soldiers who desperately need it. So that's kind of where that stands right now. And I'll leave it at that. So as an addendum to this story, I just wanted to point something out that Michael's mother, Joanne, and his widow, Kate, have both filed tort claims against the Department of Defense. And this is very interesting because for 70 years, military doctors and other healthcare providers were completely exempt from malpractice lawsuits. However, that changed in 2020 when President Trump signed the National Defense Authorization Act that year. It created a crack in that policy, which has been known as the Ferris Doctrine. Today, service members or their family members can file claims for compensation using the Federal Tort Claims Act. So Michael's family members have done this, and those tort claims are now sort of in a state of limbo. They're still being processed by the Department of Defense, and there hasn't been any definitive word back to the families. So a tort claim is just your claim. You're making a monetary claim for damages. It can be $100,000, $250,000, $1 million, whatever that claim may be. If the Department of Defense declines that tort claim, then you could potentially move into a lawsuit and suing the federal government. So I think that's an interesting epilogue to this story, that some of the policy stuff behind the scenes is also changing and being challenged, and new norms may be emerging in how we relate to the Department of Defense, quite frankly. To wrap up this episode, I would just like to shine some light on another story I did. I also recently covered another military suicide. That was a SEAL Team 6 member. His name was Bill Mulder. I've written about him in the past as well, interviewed his widow and talked to other people about him. It's another very sad story. His descent into substance abuse and post-traumatic stress. And, he left behind a great family. His brother-in-law, Will served in the CIA and was already seeing his teammates, his colleagues having mental health issues. And he realized that there's a real problem. There's a stigma around mental health for people. Again, this group that I've referred to as secret soldiers, these clandestine troops who serve in JSOC and the intel world, that they do not want to self-report mental health issues because they're afraid of losing their top secret clearance, of losing their job, what their teammates will say about them. And so there's an effort to try to remove this stigma. And what Will Negley has done is created this app called Sound Off. And I think Sound Off is something that could really have helped Michael Froede, because he would not self-report because he was, in large part, because he was so scared of losing his job in the Army. It was a job that he loved. What this app Sound Off does, it's specially made for people who live and work in this world to seek mental health anonymously and to connect with mental health care workers, with psychologists in a completely anonymous fashion over this app, and offer some sort of a pressure release to get them talking to psychologists. And if they're interested, then move that to the next step, to a sort of in-person meeting with a psychologist. But that app is active now, and William hopes to spread it nationwide and really get the word out there to the operators, to the HUMINTers, to all of these folks who are in this world. And, I agree with him that I think it could make a big difference for a lot of the soldiers out there. And I think it would have made a difference for Michael. Michael was in this position that his mental health got so bad, he thought the Army psychologists were undercover CIA officers interrogating him. And, by that point, he was just so far gone. I think it became harder and harder for his family and his colleagues to reach out to him. So Sound Off is worth checking out. I hope that those of you who are still in the military will take a look at it and spread it around. Let your friends and colleagues know about it. And that's it. I'm sorry this episode maybe was a little bit of a bummer, guys, but, I think this is a really important issue. I feel really passionate about it. I've covered these issues for almost 10 years now. And quite frankly, I feel like it affects me as well, because in the process of writing these stories and talking to these widows and these mothers, I come to feel like I knew these soldiers myself. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, this is serious stuff. And, we should, change these norms. We should change these or do away with this stigma and just see, just like we have pre-deployment training and workups and all these sorts of things that we do, this preventative maintenance on our gear, we should definitely understand that we can do all of these things on our psychology as well, on the psychology of our soldiers. It should be just part of the routine, right? So let us know what you think. I hope that you got something out of this episode. I hope that you'll share it with some of your teammates out there, and things can change. It's going to take a little bit of time. The bureaucracy grinds slowly, but I do believe that we can do a better job than we're doing now. So thank you. And I'm Jack Murphy. This is Military Matters.
This episode was written by Jack Murphy and produced by Rod Rodriguez. You can follow Military Matters on Twitter at StripesMMPod. Be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcast and save 50% on your digital subscription at stripes.com when you use promo code podcast. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
And we'll see you at the next episode. This episode is brought to you by TektoGear, TektoGear.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The TektoGear knives won't cost you half a month's rent either. Today, TektoGear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TektoGear.com. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to TektoGear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase.